Right, Your Excellency, David Daly, Mr. Alastair Walton, Professor Jacqueline Lowe, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my very special pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. As always, we acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and whose cultures are amongst the oldest continuing cultures in human history. I'm Professor Jane Godfrey, and I'm Dean of the College of Business and Economics at the ANU. As a partner college to the ANU Centre for European Studies, our college is delighted to co-host the annual Schuman Lecture, which caps off the business and economics focused year for the Centre. Some of you are regular friends of the Centre and partners in the activities of that Centre. But a word about it is indeed warranted for those who are perhaps new to the European Centre's activities, and so just a brief introduction. As you would be aware, the ANU is recognised internationally as Australia's leading research university with a long-standing record of excellence in research and education in European studies. Our location in the national capital has enabled the ANU to establish strong relations with the European Union delegation, the embassies of the member states, and the Australian government and its agencies. Europe-focused education and research takes place across the entire campus of the ANU, but the hub of all Europe-related academic and outreach activities is the ANU Centre for European Studies, led by Professor Jacqueline Lowe and her team. The Centre is the oldest European Union centre in Australia and has been supported by major operational grants for more than a decade now. In an increasingly globalised world, Australia's long-term prosperity relies on its ability to maintain a highly productive, flexible and open economy. Effective relations with the world's economic powers are therefore paramount, and arguably the European Union is the world's leading soft power and therefore particularly relevant to us in that context. ANU College of Business and Economics Research and Education in International Business focuses on the principles and processes of managing business in a global environment, with emphasis placed on international issues in the internal and external environments of business and the management responses to those issues in different country contexts. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce to you His Excellency David Daly, Ambassador and Head of Delegation for the Delegation of the European Union for Australia and to New Zealand. Mr. Daly has been a very proactive ambassador, playing a significant role in the deepening of relations between the European Union and Australia, including the development of the treaty-level EU-Australia agreement. His Excellency David Daly has worked in the external relations side of the EU service for almost 20 years now and previously served in the Irish diplomatic service. Ambassador Daly had previously been the acting director in the European Commission, responsible for the accession negotiations of Croatia and Turkey to the European Union and for relations between the EU and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. He had been responsible for relations with many countries of the Western Balkans since 2000. Previously, Ambassador Daly had been posted to Budapest from 1996 to 2000 and had worked as a trade negotiator for the EU, where, among other things, he had served on the Standings Dispute Settlement and Notification Panel at the World Trade Organization in Geneva. On joining the European Commission, Ambassador Daly worked first in the agricultural policy area. In the Irish Public Service, Ambassador Daly served in the Irish Embassy in New Delhi, India, in the Department of Foreign Affairs, Dublin, and in the Irish Department of Agriculture, Dublin. Ambassador Daly has a master's degree in economic science, European Studies from Dublin University Trinity College in Dublin, an honours degree as Bachelor of Public Administration from University College Dublin, and graduate membership of the Institute of Personnel Management, London. He recently completed an executive management course in leadership at the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, Cambridge, and is, of course, well known to many of us. I now call upon His Excellency, Mr. David Daly, who will speak about the significance of the Schuman Lecture and introduce our keynote speaker, Alastair Walton, President and Chairman of the Board and of the European Australian Business Council. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome His Excellency David Daly.
Mr. Senator, Excellencies, Madam Professor, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, my thanks go to the Europe Centre, to the ANU College of Business and Economics, and to the Europe-Australia Business Council for sponsoring this event. It's a very great pleasure to be here. The Schuman Lecture is a very significant one in the EU calendar. Why? Because, quite simply, it commemorates the beginning of the European Union. The European Union started out by pooling its coal and steel production, in the words of the Schuman Declaration, that's to say, the declaration of the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman. It was done to make war between the historic rivals France and Germany not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. The world was a different place back then, in 1950, 62 years ago, 2 generations. With the world torn apart with war, the European coal and steel community was part of Europe's long march back to prosperity and stability. Foreign Minister Schuman's vision was of creating a new Europe through a series of incremental steps. He said, and I quote, "Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single plan. It will be built through concrete achievements which first create a de facto solidarity." As we know, the European Union has grown from 6 countries to 27 today, and next year to 28 when Croatia joins. All of these countries have pooled more than just their coal and steel. They have pooled part of their sovereignty in other areas because they believe in the idea, an idea born in the Schuman Declaration, that, and I quote, "the contribution which an organized and living Europe can bring to civilization is indispensable to the maintenance of peaceful relations." Schuman's vision of building Europe through incremental steps is extremely helpful in explaining how and why the EU has evolved. However, this evolutionary process has itself been fueled by responding to crises of one sort or another. We've heard a lot lately about the European Union, and a lot of it has been doom, gloom, and disaster, if we were to believe it. But I'm happy to reassure you that we are not witnessing the end of the European Union. But what we are witnessing, in fact, is another iteration of this evolutionary process. We should remember, much has been done by the EU in the past 2 years to overcome the current economic problems. We are repairing our banking system, strengthening our economic governance, setting up credible financial firewalls, and providing unprecedented solidarity to those member states most exposed to the crisis. We are promoting structural economic reforms, like those needed to improve our competitiveness. And we're also addressing internal fiscal imbalances, especially in the Eurozone. A key concern is growth, but it is clear that for growth to come back to important levels and to restore confidence, we need fiscal consolidation, we need structural reforms and targeted investment. The EU has not been without its challenges in the past and will not be without them in the future either. However, the solution is not to throw up our hands and simply say, I always knew this wouldn't work, or the European Union is dead, such as some commentators here in Australia have said recently. On the contrary, the solution is to face up to the challenges, to work through them, and to come out the other end stronger and better than before. This has been the way that the EU has worked in the past, and it is the way that the EU is working now and will work in the future. Every challenge propels us to be stronger and better than before. We have had a great many distinguished guests deliver the Schuman Lecture. Lord Leon Britton, Lord Chris Patten, Justice Michael Kirby, to name a few. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Alastair Walton as the latest in this long and illustrious list. I've known Alastair for some time now, and I can vouch for his international credentials. He has lived all over the world: Tokyo, New York, London, Hong Kong, Rome, to name a few. But in the words of the Qantas ad, he still calls Australia home. Who would blame him? Among his homes, he has incidentally generously let it out to a very famous man visiting who was working on the filming of The Great Gatsby. So when we're looking at DiCaprio in this role, we should look and just check whether the window curtains match in Alastair's house in Sydney or not, but let's not go very far down that road. Alastair has strong business and personal connections with Europe. And he has brought his knowledge of Australian and European business together in his presidency of the Australia-Europe Business Council. He has been watching events unfold in Europe with great interest, and he is well placed to speak about the significance of Europe for Australia. For all of these reasons, I'm absolutely delighted that, Alastair, you are here today giving us the benefit of your experience and your wisdom for the Schuman Lecture. Thank you very, very much.
Professor Jane Godfrey, Dean of the College of Business and Economics, Professor Jacqueline Yotlow, Director of the Centre for European Studies, Ambassador David Daly, Your Excellencies, Mr Peter Gray, CEO of Austrade, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. As an alumnus of the Australian National University and its economics faculty, it is a great privilege for me to deliver this lecture in honour of one of the founding fathers of the European Union, Robert Schuman, which David mentioned, the German-born French Foreign Minister. Not only did Schuman serve with great distinction his vision for a united Europe, which remains an enduring legacy, he was also instrumental in the formation of NATO. Before my formal remarks, I would like to acknowledge my sister, Katrina Mackenzie, who is a Professor of Philosophy at Macquarie University and undertook her PhD at the ANU in 1992. I've also pleasure in acknowledging my friend Helen Baxendale, who is an ANU University medalist and who is currently teaching at Canberra College under the Teach for Australia program. Now, alas, an ANU PhD or university medal eluded me, but at a recent dinner in Sydney, the New South Wales Premier Barry O'Farrell, who was also politically active during my time at ANU, recalled that I had won the university Ironman competition during orientation week. Although there was some controversy about that, I have to say. I suspect that this will be the first ever lecture given by a former ANU Ironman, hard as believe looking at me now. But during my time at ANU, the core teachings that frame my understanding of global economics is the conduct of international trade and investment. Small countries such as Australia are price takers and have no pricing power in the delivery of their goods and services into global markets. That is to say, Australia's terms of trade are dictated by the actions and activities of large economies, which is certainly borne out by historical analysis of Australia's trade performance over the past half-century, including our wool and mineral booms. At the time that I was at ANU, Australia had an economy based on high tariffs and a rigid mechanism for setting national wages, colloquially known as the Industrial Relations Club. Wage negotiations were principally informed by projected levels of inflation and rarely linked to changes in national productivity. Professor Peter Swan and other leading academics at ANU's economic faculty argued that this was economically irrational and the only way to sustain long-term national growth was to eliminate these tariff barriers, deregulate the labour markets and build a highly productive, flexible and open economy, which is what's happened. And I've always thought that the small country price taker theorem was actually applicable to many aspects of Australian life and is particularly relevant in the areas of defence and foreign policy. In 1941, Australia was saved from invasion by one large power, Japan, by the timely intercession of another, the United States, whose entry into World War II came at a critical time when the futures of both Australia and Europe hung in the balance. At the end of the war, America's economic and industrial output, representing almost 50% of global GDP, was successfully harnessed for the massive retask of building a devastated Europe known as the Marshall Plan. Further, the Lend-Lease Agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom saw our American ally gain naval bases around the world and become the world's preeminent naval power. In Australia, the establishment of the ANZUS Treaty in 1951 has formed the cornerstone of our defence and security, which endures to this day. Since the shock of World War II and the war in the Pacific, Australia's political and government leaders have worked assiduously in a bipartisan way to nurture and cultivate our relationship with Washington. Political leaders in Australia clearly understand the vital importance of our strategic alliance with the US. Australian political leaders are also expected to engage in our region and build strong relationships with their counterparts in Beijing, Tokyo, Seoul, Jakarta, Singapore, Wellington and the Pacific, with a combination of friendly openness but assertiveness as befits Australia's status as a middle power. Australia's sheer landmass and strategic location, successive immigration waves from both Europe and Asia, strong democratic institutions and legal framework, highly performing economy, and its alliance with the US means that it is a small country which has far more regional and global significance than its population alone should warrant. And there is no doubt that Australia has successfully engaged in its Asian neighbours and has come a long way since the dismantling of the White Australia policy, with multiculturalism, the opening of the Australian economy, becoming a reliable and secure supplier of minerals and other key resources to Japan, China and Korea, educating generations of Asian leaders, support for democratisation in Asia, and playing a leading role in the formation of the G20. Despite our increasingly friendly engagement with Asia and relationships within the region, the unfortunate fact, however, is over the coming decades, our own defence and military capabilities are going to be overshadowed by those of China and India. The United States will be of critical importance to our region's stability in the decades ahead, and for the foreseeable future, the US, with its massive naval and military capability, will remain the only hard power in the world able to maintain open sea lanes which are essential to global trade. But one thing is certain, the dynamics in the region are changing and we cannot assume that the path will be a straightforward one. In this regard, Australia cannot rely on US hard power alone for its security. Indeed, from a strategic perspective, things are going to get a lot trickier for Australia in the Asian century, and Australia will have to be increasingly nimble in managing its relationships with China and across the region. In a recent article, the Executive Director of ASPI, Peter Jennings, wrote, quote, "We are not about to be attacked, but the region looks less stable. US-China relations are developing a harder edge to military competition. China, Japan, India and other Asia-Pacific countries are vigorously modernising their forces. The potential for at-sea confrontations over resource claims in the South China Sea is rising. Space and cyberspace are tense, contested domains with little international agreements on how to curb aggression. There is no more vital strategic interest for Australia than to ensure the US remains deeply engaged in the Asian security. It escapes no one in the region that a large rotational US Marine and Air Force presence in Australia's north would massively complicate an adversary's plan to do us harm." Australia will need to rethink its geopolitical alliances beyond its hard power relationships with the United States and regional engagement with Asia to significantly upgrade its relationship with the world's largest economy and the leading soft power in global affairs, the European Union. The proposition I wish to make in this lecture is that Australia's relationship with the European Union must be seen as strategically as important with that of the United States, China and Indonesia. The dynamics of this relationship and what underpins it need not only be well understood across a political divide, but must also resonate with the public at large. The Australia-EU relationship must be viewed as core business for any Australian leader. Let me explain by what I mean by when I refer to Europe as the world's leading soft power and why it's so important to our future. Over the 60 years, Robert Schuman's vision of building European unity has been secured through the creation of a common market and the building of common institutions. The European Union has evolved into the world's largest single market, comprising 27 member states, 500 million consumers, a combined GDP of over 17 US trillion, and a common currency, the euro, in 17 member states. European soft power is derived from the interaction of a multiplicity of elements. The term soft power was first coined by Harvard academic Joseph Nye in 1990 and later referred by the US Secretary of Defence Robert Gates to include, quote, "the civilian instruments of national security, diplomacy, strategic communications, foreign assistance, civic action and economic reconstruction and development." Arguably, the European Union has been the most successful political institution in the world to make use of soft power, backed by its economic size and diversity, history and cultural institutions, successive waves of enlargement which have brought democracy and freedom to those previously imprisoned behind the Iron Curtain. In July 2013, Croatia will become the 28th member state of the EU, with Serbia, Montenegro and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia having been accepted as official candidates for membership. Yet little more than a decade ago, the Balkans were emerging from yet another bloody conflict in the history of the peninsula. The prospect of EU membership has brought a lasting peace and the prosecution of those who committed war crimes. Europe has also been the founder and remains the home of a multitude of globally respected institutions, from those engaged in the promotion of democracy and human rights to those regulating trade, labour and environmental standards. The World Trade Organisation, OPEC, the International Labour Organisation and the World Health Organisation, to name a few. Further, in July this year, the world will once again focus attention on the Olympics, which is a European creation. Europe's commitment and institutional capacity to advocate democracy, the rule of law and human rights promote the same shared values as we hold, making Europe our natural ally as we confront the challenges that would inevitably arise during the Asian century. I would like to develop the concept of European soft power as it relates to the regulation of business globally. As the largest single market in the world, this has had a profound influence, for better or for worse, on global regulatory standards. The Economist noted in 2007, quote, "Brussels is becoming the world's regulatory capital. The EU is a big market with almost 500 million consumers, but neither size nor zeal nor sneaky protectionism explains what is usurping America's role as a source of global standards. A better answer lies in transatlantic philosophical differences. The American model turns on a cost-benefit analysis, with regulators weighing the effects of new rules on jobs and growth, as well as testing the significance of any risks. In Europe, corporate innocence is not assumed. Yet the more prescriptive European vision may suit consumer and industry demands for certainty. If you manufacture globally, it is simpler to be bound by the toughest regulatory regime in your supply chain." 2012 marks the 20th anniversary of the European single market. While this is far from complete, as Ambassador Daly mentioned, Europe has been economically transformed by the 4 freedoms of the internal market: the freedom of goods, services, capital and people across national borders. The EU is now a single marketplace comprising a population 20 times that of Australia and an economy more than 10 times that of ours, while COAG is now making good progress towards a seamless national economy. The scale of this enterprise is rather modest when compared with Europe's effort to build its internal market. Europe is also the largest donor of overseas development assistance, providing more than half the world's aid. It is the second largest donor of the Pacific after Australia and is the largest trading partner with developing countries in the Pacific. Modern Australia has been founded on European immigration and European capital. Approximately 70% of Australia's population is of European descent, and with an investment of $650 billion, Europe is the single largest investor in our economy, providing a third of all foreign investment. Europe is closely followed by the United States at $550 billion. So in total, more than 60% of all our foreign investment is sourced from the EU and the US. Now, China is clearly Australia's top trading partner, having overtaken Europe some time ago. However, Europe is still our top trading partner in services, and China currently only represents 1 to 2% of our foreign investment, although with enormous potential for growth. Having looked at the critical importance of the US alliance to Australia's security, Europe's role as a global leader in soft power, and the predominance of European and US investment in Australia, it's also interesting to reflect on the vital nature of the relationship between Europe and the United States itself. In macro terms, Europe and the United States combined still account for half of global GDP. Europe and the US are each other's largest source of foreign direct investment, and together they generate around 3/4 of global financial services, around 1/3 of global trade, and almost as much as every other country in the world counts the EU or the US as their top trading partner. Further, of all the Fortune 500 global companies, as ranked by revenue, the EU has 148 companies, the US 133, and Japan and China combined have 129. The GSC has abundantly illustrated the interconnected nature of global business and the financial markets, which is clearly apparent in the integrated nature of the transatlantic political and economic relationship between the EU and the United States. What it means to us in Australia is that our most important and security ally and second largest investor, the US, and our most important foreign investor and second largest trading partner, the EU, are totally connected with each other economically. Australia's relationship with the United States is well served by a plethora of organisations covering a wide spectrum of government, economic, business and research dialogue. For example, the Australian government has made an endowment of $25 million to fund a US study centre. Further, the annual Australia-American Leadership Dialogue is seen as a vitally important part of the bilateral relationship, bringing together current and future political, business and policy leaders. Interestingly, many members of the European-Australia Business Council are also members of the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue and are active participants in its programs. There is a further overlap, with many participating formally and informally with business and government relationships encompassing China, Japan, India and many other countries in Asia. In my view, the magnitude and dimensions of the Australia-Europe relationship are of such importance in the Asian century that a complete strategic rethink is required by the Australian government and the business community towards Europe. Australia has been very slow to recognise, understand and react to the profound changes occurring within the EU over the past decades and its likely further evolution in the decades ahead. First, there will be an increasing concentration of power and influence at the European institutions of the European Council, the European Commission, the European Parliament, the European Central Bank and the European Court of Justice. Secondly, the increasing political and economic influence of non-European G20 countries will mean that European soft power will increasingly be exercised by agencies at the EU level with a capacity to do so, including the new European External Action Service, which is jargon for its diplomatic corps. Thirdly, EU members will have no option but to adopt further internal market reforms, fiscal centralisation and consolidation at the EU level. In my view, Australia has a poor understanding of the core philosophical understandings of European unity and the choices European leaders make in support of this, which often does not appear to be economically rational from the outside. Further, there is no doubt that the Australian political class as a whole has not thought through the benefit of working with its European counterparts in attempting to influence the direction of EU policy in the decades ahead. I suspect that for far too long, Australia viewed its relationship with Europe from the narrow prism of agriculture and the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP. The European-Australia Business Council, of which I'm the chairman, was established with the support of the EU in 1990 and has grown to become an organisation with annual revenues coming close to $1 million a year and a board of directors comprising some of the most influential business and policy figures in Australia. The intellectual framework for the EABC was actually established by an American, none other than the legendary Wall Street guru, Abby Joseph Cohen, who on her first trip to Australia posed the question, why does Australia view its relationship with Europe almost entirely from the prism of agriculture when it represents only 2% of your GDP and Europe as a whole is your largest economic partner? It makes no sense to me. Members of the EABC represent a broad spectrum of business, government and social leaders, including the group of 8 universities. Our perspective is that while agriculture is a very important contributor to the Australian economy and represents 12% of total exports of goods and services, it should not distort the development of our relationship with Europe and its soft power. The United States also provides subsidies to its farmers. But this has not been an impediment to our special relationship with Washington, nor to concluding a free trade agreement in 2005. That said, it is important to recognise that things are changing and quite rapidly. The visit by Kevin Rudd to Brussels at the commencement of his term as Prime Minister was a strategically important step. Further, his decision to appoint the former leader of the Opposition and Defence Minister, Dr Brendan Nelson, as Australia's ambassador to the EU and NATO was inspired. In 2006, I led the first ever mission of Australian business leaders to Brussels. What shocked the delegation was that our interlocutors in Brussels were actually expecting us to be a bunch of angry farmers who had come to discuss agriculture and the CAP. It was very clear to us that there was very little real understanding at the European Commission about the strength, depth and diversity of the Australian economy, nor of our 25 years of economic reform. The question I posed at the time, well, whose problem is this state of ignorance? The European Commission's or ours? My thoughts went right back to Professor Swan at ANU. As a delegation representing a small country price takers, it was our problem. 6 years later, I had the honour of hosting the President of the European Commission, Jose Manuel Barroso, at an EABC lunch in Sydney, and I understood he addressed an audience here. And it was the first such visit to Australia in 30 years. I'm advised that upon his return to Brussels, President Barroso spoke enthusiastically for 40 minutes with his fellow commissioners about his visit to Australia and what he had seen and learned about microeconomic reform and its impact on our competitiveness and public finances. In just 2 weeks, I will lead the 6th Australia Business Mission to Europe, where we will again meet with President Barroso and other commissioners, as well as leaders of the European Parliament, the European Central Bank, Business Europe, and other important institutions that make up the EU framework. These business missions, I believe, are playing a very important constructive role in breaking down many of the myths and misconceptions in Europe about Australia and in Australia about Europe. I also applaud the Australian Government and Austrade's funding to promote the Brand Australia campaign in key markets around the world. The campaign is dedicated to, quote, enhance awareness of contemporary Australian credentials in business, science, education, technology, creativity and the not-for-profit activity. And I am pleased that the EABC is one of many partners supporting this campaign. The work undertaken by the Australian Government and the European Commission to finalise a treaty-level bilateral agreement this year is also a very important step in taking the relationship to the next level. But this in itself is not sufficient. Australia needs to work on a completely new strategic framework for its relationship with Europe, incorporating 5 key elements. Commissioning a white paper on Australia's relationship with Europe. Reviewing and enhancing the way the Australian Government resources are deployed in Europe. Developing a program of official visits to engage Europe's investment community. Establishing an Australian-Europe leadership dialogue. And lastly, commencing negotiations for a comprehensive free trade agreement. I will comment on each one of these 5 elements. White paper. The Australian Government has commissioned Dr Ken Henry to undertake a white paper on Australia in the Asian century. This paper has enormous significance, not only from an economic perspective, but because of the broader geopolitical implications, including the impact on our defence architecture and related procurement. I believe the Australian Government should also commission a white paper which analyses and makes recommendations on the totality of European soft power and how Australia can better position itself to influence this in support of our regional security and further European investment in our country. The paper should also analyse Europe's relationships with Australia's major partners, including the US, China, India and the Pacific, and to identify areas of common interests and actions. The paper should make recommendations for devising mechanisms to enhance Australia's influence in Brussels, London, Paris Berlin, Warsaw and other important European capitals. Australian government resources and Europe. Australia's current representation in Brussels needs to be benchmarked against our embassies in Washington, London, Beijing and Jakarta. It is disturbing to note that the American Chamber of Commerce in Brussels and our cousins in New Zealand focus far greater resources to Brussels than the Australian government does. Our embassy in Brussels should be the coordinating hub for the Australian diplomatic efforts across the EU with the staffing and research capabilities to match. As previously mentioned, the appointment of the respected national political figure, Dr. Brendan Nelson, as ambassador to the European Union and NATO, has given enormous impetus to the way Australia is represented in Brussels. Traditionally, only Washington and London have been seen as appropriate locations for political appointees with close connections to the government of the day. It should be remembered that the European Commissioners and European Parliaments generally are political leaders in their own right. The Australian government should continue to send ambassadors to Brussels with comparable levels of diplomatic and political standing as they regularly send to Washington, London, Beijing and Jakarta. Australia's diplomatic efforts should also be reorganised, with our ambassador to the EU and NATO also being designated as ambassador for Europe. In addition to their country-specific undertakings, Australian ambassadors accredited to individual member states could also be charged with responsibilities for Europe-wide policy issues such as energy, innovation, climate change and food security. Our embassies in member states should also work closely with Brussels' mission on relationship building with the European Commissioner from each country, together with influential members of the European Parliament. Now, I am conscious that it is rare to hear a business person advocating more funding for government agencies. But it is clear to me that it is not in Australia's long-term national interest to consistently cut the budgets of those agencies which represent Australia's interests globally. It seems counterproductive to me that at a time when Australia's SME sector is struggling under the combined weight of a high dollar, real interest rates, high wages and high taxes, that the Australian government consistently reduced its funding to Austrade and DFAT, $375 million and $2 billion in the current budget, while spending over $7 billion on AusAid. I, for one, would like to know the actual impact of so-called efficiency dividends on the programs being undertaken by Austrade and DFAT, and an explanation why resources devoted to AusAid have grown rapidly while those devoted to Austrade and DFAT have been repeatedly cut. Developing new markets and shaping policy outcomes in the US and Europe are resource-intensive investments, and the budget for Austrade and DFAT in this regard seems woefully inadequate to the growing demands expected of them. Official visits. At a meeting with the Australian Prime Minister in Brussels in 2010, I made the point that the Australian government performs poorly compared with many countries in terms of ministers taking on roles as ambassadors for the Australian business sector when travelling overseas. There are many dimensions to the problem, including the sensitivity to taxpayer-funded travel to Europe, cumbersome approval processes, and the expectation that our embassies will secure official meetings first and then fit in business interests if and when they can. The economic diplomacy undertaken by Austrade in Europe to encourage investment in Australia needs support from both the government and business sectors. And I'm pleased that during our forthcoming visit to Frankfurt and The Hague, EABC members will be making a contribution to this by making presentations on the Australian economy and its investment potential. But much more needs to be done to institutionalise this effort. The Prime Minister and leading government ministers should regularly undertake economic missions and work better with our embassies, Austrade and business organisations in targeting those countries, companies and institutions which have major investments in Australia. It would come as a surprise to many in this audience that the Netherlands is the 4th largest investor in the Australian economy, and Belgium is the 11th. The chairmen, CEOs and CFOs of Australian public companies with significant offshore investments devote considerable period of their time being on the road and reporting on their performance and future business plans to investors. This should be no different for Australian government leaders, particularly in light of the growing capital and funding needs of Australian companies, our banking sector and the government sector as a whole. Australia-Europe Leadership Dialogue. Earlier I referred to the importance of the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue. Founded in 1992, this dialogue has become a pillar of Australia-US relations and a forum for government, business and policy figures to meet and discuss key aspects of the special relationship. A key objective of the EABC is to see a similar dialogue launched on a biennial basis between Australia and Europe. An Australia-Europe dialogue will serve the purpose of galvanising all the elements I've referred to above, and the inaugural dialogue could be held either this year or next year, with its theme being policies for growth. Europe can offer insights into its progress and achieving a common market of 500 million people, which is relevant to our COAG process, while Australia can share insights in its decades of microeconomic reform and public sector reform, together with our respective experiences in the US and Asia. Free trade agreement. The EU is unambiguously targeting many of Australia's trade and investment partners for free trade agreements, including India, Japan, Korea, Malaysia and Singapore. Although it has a preference for entering FTA discussion with non-OECD countries, since 2009, the EU has been negotiating closer economic relations and a trade agreement with Canada. The reason this came about is that Canada's government and business community combined forces to provide a compelling case to do so. As David Mortimer said in his review of Australia's export policies and programs in 2008, with the conclusion of the Australia-US FTA and the launch of negotiations with Japan and China, and the prospect of negotiation with India, Indonesia and the Republic of Korea, the European Union is the only major trading partner with which Australia is not negotiating or considering an FTA. An FTA with Europe should be seen by now as, for Australia, as strategically important as the government viewed its FTA with the United States, and apply the focus, drive and resources necessary to achieve it. With stalled negotiations at Doha level, an FTA between Australia and the EU should be the appropriate vehicle for setting an ambitious agenda for removing obstacles to Australian agricultural exporters, removing unfair taxes on imported automobiles, devising mechanisms for resolving a range of differences on food standards and other regulatory non-tariff barriers. With Europe now Australia's largest service provider, Australia should be seeking a comprehensive FTA including mutual recognition of professional qualifications in the services sector. Now, given that this lecture is sponsored by the ANU Economics Department, my former alma mater, it would be remiss of me not to address some of the fundamental economic challenges that Europe needs to confront. This is not just a question of academic interest, but is vitally important to Europe's stability and its future capacity to project soft power in the Asian century. The debate about whether the euro and the eurozone is fundamentally viable from an economic perspective has exercised the minds of many distinguished economists and heated great debate. As merely a former ANU Ironman, I suspect that I'm not alone in trying to make sense of this. The debate has become so polarised, and with plausible arguments on both sides, it's difficult to judge the outcome. A key question asked in this debate is whether more could have been done to avert the current Eurozone crisis. Now, a Treasury official would probably argue that interest rates in the Eurozone were set on inflationary expectations for the economies of Germany and France by the ECB. They were therefore set too low to prevent an asset price bubble in Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain. But I'm not sure that had interest rates been set on a more restrictive basis, this would have changed things fundamentally. My view is the banking and bond markets took the view that with the advent of the euro, the economies within it would converge in productivity terms, justifying similar asset and labour prices across the Eurozone. This led to a wave of money seeking higher returns in high-risk economies, which was somehow expected to transform into German models of productivity. The markets overlooked for far too long the fact that German asset price and labour costs remained tightly controlled, while productivity increased significantly in Germany, contrasting with the rising asset price and labour costs in the peripheral member states that way outstrip their productivity growth. Financial largesse applied in the peripheral member states was aided and abetted by a massive regulatory arbitrage courtesy of the Bank of International Settlement capital rules for banks and insurance companies. These rules had the effect of encouraging banks to buy risk-free rated sovereign debt of peripheral member states and which had no requirement for capital to be put aside for possible default. And this debt could be held on a bank's balance sheet at face value rather than at mark to market. So again, I wonder whether this situation of high real interest rates in the Eurozone prior to the GFC would have really affected the deficit funding of Greece and Portugal and the asset price bubbles in Spain and Ireland. Throughout history, we have seen speculative bubbles including tulips, nutmegs, dot-com and mining, which do not necessarily react to interest rates or monetary policy settings, but develop a life of their own until they burn out, with all the loss, pain and suffering that accompanies this. So we are at such a time of pain and suffering within the Eurozone, or more correctly, within parts of the Eurozone, because if you visit Germany, you certainly get a different perspective than if you visit Athens or Madrid. And indeed, things are pretty tough in non-Eurozone Britain, which raises another question. Well, would this speculative bubble have happened anyway, with or without a single currency? But we do have a single currency, and everyone from Madrid to Manila to Monaco asks themselves, well, what's going to happen next? An enormously complicating factor is the institutional framework around the euro, which was fundamentally conceived as a political project, despite the best efforts to build some firm ground rules to ensure integrity of the system. The complexity of establishing the euro and the political compromises necessary to achieve it currently leave Europe with some profoundly difficult issues to deal with. While the focus of the crisis is on the common currency, essentially it's a crisis of public sector finances in EU member states and of the public institutions, banks and other investors who continue to finance unsustainable levels of public debt. Business people generally have a pragmatism based on hard-headed self-interest. And the interesting thing to me is despite the current crisis, there is still strong public and business support from the euro. In recent opinion polls, 80% of the Greek population want to be part of the euro despite austerity. There is great value in eliminating exchange rate risk and the flexibility associated with the movement of capital. In a similar vein, there are regions and states within the US that would theoretically be better off with their own currencies. There are persistent economic and income differences in the United States regions and states based on comparative advantage which have been locked in for decades as a result of their single currency. Prior to the establishment of the euro, housing prices and labour costs in southern Europe were a fraction of those in northern Europe. Now that the free champagne from the bond markets has been cut off and the absence of a flexible exchange rate, there is going to be a very painful adjustment of income, costs and asset prices in Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain as they move to levels reflecting their comparative advantage in the Eurozone. And this comparative advantage difference may persist for generations as per the US. Interesting though, I'm less concerned with Italy despite having an apartment in Rome. Italy is a highly productive, export and wealthy economy. And Italy has a somewhat underserved reputation, largely a result of its political theatre, which has been substantially addressed. But its banking and domestic savings are sound, more compared with Spain, and its economy is far more sophisticated and diverse. So the establishment of the euro has had some pretty interesting outcomes and consequences when you think about Professor Swan's small country theorem. Those countries which have had the most difficult adjustment to the euro have been small countries with highly inflexible labour markets, large bureaucracies, few natural comparable advantages, and a slowness to reshape and adapt their economies in the face of globalisation. However, for those who would argue that Greece would be better off leaving the euro and returning to the drachma with its own exchange rate, I would point out that if currency devaluation was an alternative to sound fiscal management, Zimbabwe would be the richest country in the world. And unlike business reporting to their shareholders, regulators, market commentators and financial analysts, most governments in Europe, and indeed globally, have been unwilling to have a mature discussion with their voters about where their public sector finances stand and the real capacity to pay for past election promises of healthcare, pension and other benefits into the future. Australia is very different from Europe and the US as a result of two major reforms: the Keating superannuation reforms and the Costello intergenerational reports, which presented a factual analysis on the future demands of the Australian public sector into the future. Further, I would argue that Australia's Future Fund was as important for its educative role about public sector finances in as much as it was for the provisioning of the federal public servant pensions for which it was established. These and other initiatives have given the Australian public a level of financial literacy not evident in Europe or the US. I can't think of another country in which the evening news includes reports on global share markets, exchange rates, and the price of major commodities, including gold and oil. Economic circumstances are going to lead to a broader debate about what it means to have a more harmonised internal market. And here I'm talking about further pension reform and labour market flexibility in Europe. For I think there will be a great deal of resistance by China, India and other high-growth economies in having IMF facilities allocated to countries without undertaking painful domestic reforms. This cannot be avoided at all if Europe is to grow into the future. Australia, with its 25 years of microeconomic reform under both Labor and Liberal governments, has a great deal to offer Europe in terms of sound advice in this area. Although in totality, the Eurozone is a huge economic power, in order to flourish, it has to adopt and adapt to the theories of Professor Swan and the ANU economic faculty and think more like a small power price taker. For the economic challenges posed by the rise of Asia have only just begun. So to conclude, I for one do not see the breakup of the euro as a likely outcome, but I do see the ECB having to provide a little bit more liquidity to the banking system, somewhat less austerity than is currently being advocated by Germany, and a lot more microeconomic reform than the peripheral member states would like. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope by now it's abundantly clear that while Europe has enormous issues to deal with, it is economically and strategically aligned with Australia. It has shared values, the same rule of law, and it is absolutely in our national interest that the EU project is successful because of our need for Europe to continue to project its soft power into the future of the Asian century. Australian government and business leaders have not paid sufficient attention to the influence and importance of European soft power in global affairs. There needs to be a whole of government rethink about the shape, scope and nature of our engagement with Europe, and the European Australian Council can play a continuing role in this regard and the promotion of it. The European Union has been an extraordinarily successful political, economic and social project which has united a continent with a history marked by endless conflict and which was almost brought to the brink of utter devastation in the 20th century. As the march of history brings us closer together in this part of the world, let's work together to shape a better Europe based on our common values. Thank you very much.
Well, I am quite sure that I speak on behalf of everyone within the College of Business and Economics when I say that we are pleased that Professor Swan's Ironman student has progressed to become such an articulate and passionate advocate of sound economic theory, sound international business practices, and of the importance of the European-Australian alignment. So would you please join with me again in thanking Mr. Alastair. Ladies and gentlemen, Alastair has very kindly agreed to take questions, and we have time for just one or two if there are any burning issues that someone would like to raise at this point. We have a roving microphone, and what I will ask is if you could please stand, state your name and affiliation before asking a question. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Walton, for a very stimulating presentation. I'm Carmen Lindemann. I work for Department of Industry. I was just wondering, you're advocating stronger connections with Europe, where Australia does share common values of democracy and the rule of law and a range of common values and human rights. What would be your views in relation to other countries where the values are not so similar, where, for example, in the Middle East and other countries, what would be your views and approaches in that context? Thanks.
Well, as you can tell by my personality, I have a generally optimistic nature. Otherwise, I wouldn't become an investment banker. Because you need a lot of optimism in the current markets. I think if you go back to the formation of the United Nations and look at how many countries we perceived as democratic, and you look at the march of history, and you look at the demolition of the Iron Curtain, you look at the reformers within the USSR to create the Soviet Union, within the Soviet to create Russia, and you also look at the movement of the democratic force in Russia, and including protests against Putin, And then you look at how many dictators, military dictators, have been thrown out of South America. In fact, and you look at the democratisation of Asia and places like Indonesia that were once ruled as military juntas. I'm very optimistic about the future. So I'm not a person that says, you know, you've got to shun nations that don't have those values. I think what you do is you get the democratic world working together so that to bring to places like Burma, where there has been so much pressure to reform. And I think that's a great example. Now, I also think if you look at what's happening in China with Bo and the Maoists, etc., you're seeing a democratic movement being generated in China, which is going to be impossible to suppress. And in fact, I think President Hu, in his remarks, said that the reform of the system is inevitable. So if I look around and I think about India and South America and the Americas and Asia, etc., I'm very optimistic about democracy, the rule of law. And I frankly think that, you know, compared with 20 years ago, the pendulum has completely moved in the right direction. And I think also, if we look at investment and free trade, and I speak as a banker, if you're looking at a country that's got an undemocratic system, the discount rates you apply to projects because of effectively changes in it are very, very high and discourage investment. So I think for all these reasons, trade, investment and simply information, that things are moving in the right direction. So I'm always a person that wants to embrace a country, and I include, by the way, Fiji in that. I would like to see a change in Fiji. I would like to see us do more with aid, etc., to embrace change in Fiji. But I think you can't sort of say, look, you know, we're democratic, you're not, and we're going to ignore you.
Peter Drysdale, Crawford School. Thanks very much, Alastair, for an inspiring talk. I've got just 3 points. First of all, I should say I've got good news and bad news about the Ironman performance. Actually, Ross Garnaut was the first winner of the Ironman race, so you're in good company. That's a good news. But you're not the first to deliver a lecture with that status, although I don't think he's given a Schuman Lecture before. The first point is about a European white paper. I think probably you should think carefully about that because you might get what you wish for and you might have to serve on its advisory committee. The second point is about the relationship. I'm sure many in this room would share the ambitions you have for the relationship between Europe and Australia, which amazingly in many respects, as you say, is underdeveloped. But I wonder about the FTA slogan. It seems to me that leads you back to the future in a direction that you explicitly said you didn't want to go around agriculture and all that, whereas really what you're asking for, I think, is something well beyond a traditional FTA, something that encompasses a comprehensive economic and cooperation agreement that is not only economic but political in its character. So I'd welcome your thoughts on that idea. And the third point is really about the theatres of international diplomacy in which Australia and Europe now have to operate. And importantly, of course, because of what's going on in Europe and globally, the priority there is the G20 process and cooperation in the G20 process on stabilisation in Europe, on sustainable long-term recovery in the global economy. And I wonder what your thoughts there are about the priorities that Australia and Europe should have in cooperation via the immediate tasks that Europe has to face beyond that, that we should have. Because, as you know, in 2014 we'll be hosting in Australia the G20 summit. And 2 years is a very short time. And if we're going to develop an active international agenda with Europe around the G20 process, in which Australia certainly has a priority interest, we probably better think about that pretty soon.
Well, thanks. It's a remarkable bit of history, but I did some work, our investment bank did some work for Ross Garnaut in New Guinea. And I spoke to my father about that, who was an Australian diplomat. He said, just give Ross my regards. It transpires that my father helped Ross Garnaut write his PhD when we lived in Thailand, so it's a very small world. But I didn't realise that he was an Iron Man, and I'm going to go back. I'm going to go and challenge him in front of this audience to a few things. I think the worst thing was having to drink the creek water and then having to eat raw sausage and stuff like this. This is not a traditional Iron Man. It was an orientation week Iron Man, and I think everyone was shocked that I won. But I'm very pleased that Professor Garnaut was the leading light of that. I think that I wanted to make one sort of comment that I didn't raise in my speech, and I'm actually, within the G20, I have as many concerns about what's happening in the US than I do as what's happening in Europe, with one complicating factor, and that is that it was very interesting to me that when there was a change in France, the first thing that the French president did was meet with Merkel and meet with within the EU, etc. And so there was a discourse, and I guess I want to get onto the G20 point. But the way Europe works is there has to be a discourse because you're in the Eurozone, etc. So the natural way that European politicians think is, look, I may be running Germany or France or the UK, but I actually have to have a proper discourse and work this thing through with my fellow small powers and price takers. The US, the discourse is getting so difficult within a bipartisan framework, and it's running massive deficits. And my biggest concern is when this point happens, and no one's talked about Medicaid, the unaffordability of the pension system in the US, and our defence is based, well, we're relying on the US for our defence, and in a recent lunch with some senators that I host as part of being chairman of the EABC, they said, you know, we used to be able to capacity right to fight 2 wars. Now it's gone. We just have a capacity right to fight 1. That's a major change in military capacity, and we just can't fund it. So I think that in the G20 discussions, we have to, I think, have a focus on what I call this truth and honesty. And I would like to see Australia recommend to the EU that the Commission itself do an intergenerational report on Europe. Now, it's probably going to make for a very scary reading, but I think an intergenerational report on Europe, including public sector finances, would at least inform the public debate, because most of the public debate is like, you know, we're going to push the pensions up from 62 to 65 to 68, not saying, actually, we just can't afford into this. So I think as part of the G20, what we need to do is we're seeing massive growth outside the G8. Part of the G20 is going to be how are the G8 countries going to reform themselves and get their house in order, because this is not just a European problem. And if you want to have, you know, nightmares, think about the US and Europe both having fiscal problems at the same time, which you can foresee. So I'm an optimist, but I'm actually pretty concerned about what's happening in the future. Thank you.